Hi, everybody. Welcome in. We are very happy that you have decided to join us on this Memorial Day. And we are very happy as well to have Paul Wright of Cabrini University with us to discuss a film that he chose, and I, for one, am glad that he did, the best years of our lives. A few notes of business before we get started as people are entering in. Please keep your audio on mute unless I've called on you to ask your question or make your comment. The way I will know to call on you is if you use the raise hand function, which should be in the bottom of your Zoom window on your computer. And then once you've asked your question, if you can lower your hand and metaphorically and mute yourself, that would be appreciated. In addition to this, we know that we often have people from outside the greater Philadelphia area joining us. If you would care to use the chat function to type where you are from, if you're outside our general area, we would be curious to know, so please feel free to do that. I also wanted to mention that there are two remote classroom courses coming up next week. These are online versions of adapted of our regular courses, which means that there is a fee. They are not part of this Film Studies Online series, but they may be of interest, so I wanted to mention them. We are teaching another session of our flagship course, The Language of Film, which the session that's currently going on sold out, so we're starting another one on Tuesday, June 2nd. And on the afternoon of Tuesday, June 2nd, I'm giving a lecture called On the Origin of the Cinema about the cultural and technological environment that led to the creation of motion pictures. And we'll look at some early motion pictures and talk about how they came about and how different they are from what we see today, and even how different they are from movies from over 70 years ago, like tonight's film. The best years of our lives. We did receive some questions that came in over the through the Ask Andrew section of our website, and a couple of them, there are actually a number that were on sort of kind of, I guess, nuts and bolts questions about the film that I just kind of want to get out of the way. One question was some people took issue with the relative ranks of the different servicemen featured in the film. How could this guy be a captain while that guy is a sergeant? I don't know. I also don't know how much it impacts on the larger themes and message of the film, or the larger, or on, even on the characters individually. That didn't seem to be an issue for any of them. So that's something that I think we'll just kind of set aside for now, unless someone has any particular specific insight into that. The other issue was the ages of the characters. Someone noted that Myrna Loy was only a dozen or so years older than Teresa Wright, and how could you be her mother? Well, these things happen in Hollywood. They happen all the time. Usually it's an older man dating a much younger woman, which isn't biologically impossible, just really odd, and happens more in Hollywood than it tends to in the real world. But Hollywood does this all the time. I mean, I think that's about the same age difference there was between Anne Bancroft and Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, and these things happen, and Hollywood doesn't care. And they particularly didn't care back in the 40s. They thought they were telling a story and creating an illusion and giving us a window into a world that they had established. And so they didn't think that we would think or worry about those things. So we're not going to think or worry about those things. Okay, I see that we don't have any raised hands in the among our attendees in the session right now. I hope we do get some. So in the meantime, I think a good thing to start us off with was an interesting question we received about the title of the film, The Best Years of Our Lives, and what it refers to. As the person asking the question noted, the trailer, if you watch it, sort of suggests that these post-war years were the people eventually the characters eventually, as we know from watching the film, find rewarding relationships and individual paths, and that's what refers to the best years of our lives. We are sort of left perhaps with the impression, certainly for a significant portion of the film, that maybe it was their war service that was the best years of their lives. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Of course, one answer is the title refers to both. And that perspectives change. And if you think about our own lives, we know perspectives change. And that could certainly be what's going on. Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
In terms of the title and the theming of this film, I think you're meant to take that title with a grain of salt. I think the idea that these young and not so young men who've gone overseas and served have surrendered the best years of their lives, even though they've retained their lives, right? Many of their comrades don't survive. And this is mentioned a couple of times in the film, the survivor's guilt, if you will, that comes with being one who makes it home. So not only have you lost the best years of your life overseas in your service, but the life you've come home to is not necessarily the one you had in mind. And in many ways, the life you had is impossible to return to. So I've always taken the title of the film a bit ironically. I grant that the ending of the film certainly tends towards a kind of Hollywood type resolution, especially in terms of the relationships that Andrew mentions, and the fact that by the end, all three of our lead characters seem to have, to some degree or another, readjusted to civilian life. Their story isn't over. We can see that there are many struggles ahead of them, but we have this feeling that they're going to be all right. So I understand that the film's title could support a kind of rosy reading of the ending of the film, and the film certainly plays to that to a degree. But there's so much in the course of the film that is deeply troubled and anxious and suggestive of problems that cannot be resolved simply by coming home or simply by finding the right relationship. So to that extent, I've never really seen the film to be as rosy as other people do, but that could just be the cynic in me.
Well, and one of our participants pointed out, reminded me that, of course, the Virginia Mayo character says something, a line very close to the title of the film, when she's upset with the life kind of Dana Andrews is quote unquote giving her. She says, "I gave you the best years of my life, and this is how you repay me $32.50 a week," or whatever it is. And of course, she is the character in the film who gets it the least, right? And is seen as, just a shrew and an ingrate. And there, of course, it's a tremendously sort of ironic moment, because whatever she's gone through, and it appears she's gone through some things, it's nothing compared to what the others have gone through, certainly. All right, I see some hands. David, you have a question or comment?
I do. First of all, we enjoyed the movie, and in spite of the age things, which we sort of talked about, we thought it was well done, well acted, and clearly the Academy did too. You've heard me mention in a couple of the others about the music, and Janice and I were discussing the music here is very, very different than many of the movies that we've done on these Monday nights. It was subtle, but it was going along with the kinds of themes that were there. It was not in your face like last week with my cousin Elmer. It was much more sort of there, helped you think through, but I didn't feel that it was, the in your face, as you had described last week, was often the case in the 40s and the 50s, or at least the 50s. We were, or at least I was a little bit confused at the very end as to where Al was in his career. I don't know if I missed something, or if there was something that you want to comment on where the writer and director were leading us. After that boggled speech of his when he was drunk, did he resolve at the bank And I'll let you talk about those couple themes. Thank you very much. And thanks for doing this.
Sure, thank you. I think that when they're out on the sort of the porch and he's drinking his punch that has no alcohol in it, I think we're meant to think that he sort of dodged a bullet, and as long as he remains on the straight and narrow and appears he's at least reducing his alcohol consumption, I think we're meant to think that his career will proceed, sort of as it has, with some steadiness to it. Regarding your other point, I think that this is a film that is understated in a host of ways. I think one of the great strengths about this film, one of the reasons it seems a lot more contemporary, a lot more modern, it holds up better than a lot of movies from the 40s, is because of how understated it is. The drama or the dramas or the crises or the issues that befall these servicemen, none of them is extraordinary of a melodramatic sort of caliber. The music is understated, the performances are understated, the filming of those performances I think is understated. The use of close-ups for a film that has as many moments that I think contemporary practitioners of that time would have had a lot more close-ups, and also in part because of the deep focus cinematography that allows a lot to unfold in the foreground, middle ground, and background of a single framing of a single shot. You have many fewer shots in this movie than you did in the average movie of the time. I read somewhere that the average movie of the time had between 300 and 400 shots. And a film of this length, if it had been on par with others, with the style of the time, would have had between 300 and 400 shots. This had 200 shots. So there was a slower pace. Editing was pretty invisible, and there was a lot that was understated. Paul, do you have thoughts on that?
Actually, on two things there. First, I guess the cinematography, since you're bringing up the shot selection. Two examples from the film, I think, illustrate the power of Greg Toland's art, which makes every film he's involved with better. He is often called the unacknowledged directorial collaborator of many a director, not just William Wyler, but John Ford in The Grapes of Wrath, and most famously, a little film called Citizen Kane, directed by Orson Welles, where that deep focus photography is also used. The two scenes I'm thinking of here, one is fairly early on when Frederick March, Al, comes home. He gets home to his family, his beautiful apartment. He's snuck into the apartment, told the kids to be quiet so he could surprise his wife, and they reunite. But you might recall that you see this all taking place using that deep focus down a hallway. So we're the audience to that reunion, just as the two children are the audience to that reunion. And in this case, what Toland is doing with those shots has the added effect of showing us a really intimate moment and allowing us to be part of it, almost to the point of feeling uneasy. I never fail to watch that scene and imagine that I shouldn't be watching it, that somehow that is something so private between the couple that we ought not almost to see it. And of course, I can't take my eyes off of it. So that's an example of the shot creating intimacy between the characters who have reunited, even though they're going to have some struggles ahead of them, intimacy between them, and also intimacy between audience and cast within the story. The other example of it, though, and there are many others throughout the course of the film, but perhaps most famous is that eerie scene in the abandoned plane yard, the airfield, where all those decommissioned planes are sitting there basically in a graveyard and reminding you of all the loss, not just of technology, but of life in the course of the war. And so that very same technique there can be used to create alienation, to create a feeling of immensity, a feeling of being overwhelmed by circumstances, overwhelmed by history, overwhelmed by the past. And so in that sense, Toland is going back into his Citizen Kane bag of tricks, because that's exactly what he does throughout the course of that film. So on cinematography, I would say that. And just a quick observation on the Al story, right? I think Andrew said it well in that we don't know what's going to happen with Al. We don't know if he's 100% conquered his alcohol problem, but it's hinted that at least he's moving in the right direction. And he has the support of his wife and his family. The question, though, is what happens with his job? And that I don't know that we can answer because there's tension between him and his boss, Milton, that you see throughout the film, starting with Milton calling him at home basically the day he's gotten back and asking him to come back to work. And you can tell that Al doesn't want to talk to this guy at all, that he really doesn't like his boss much. And that tension persists, right? Al wants to give a loan to another veteran without much in the way of collateral. Milton doesn't like it, but he kind of lets it slide. Al gives a very contentious, actually, speech at that dinner that he shows up to, where he basically says, you told us all it was about teamwork when we were taking hills and battlefields, but now you don't want to think about the teamwork for the veterans who've come home. So there's a lot of tension there, and it's a good reminder of how much intergenerational tension is on display in this film. We don't often think of it, or at least I don't. I mean, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm a middle-aged person. I'm of a certain age. But I always imagine World War II folk as being older. That was just how I grew up thinking of them. But in this film, you are made to remember that these young or even middle-aged men like Al go fight, come home, and then find themselves in competition, if you will, with an older generation of men who didn't serve in World War II. They might have served in World War I, who knows, but they didn't serve in this war. And you see that at the dinner. Think of how many older men are at that dinner, including Mr. Milton, his boss. And there's a direct kind of one-upmanship going on there in terms of who put in the real time, who did the real heavy lifting in the service. And Milton, by the way, is played by the amazing Ray Collins, the associate of Orson Welles. And Ray Collins might be most famous for playing Boss Geddes in Citizen Kane, right? The politician that Kane wants to unseat, but then ends up throwing Kane's life into scandal. So that was a lot, but those were really interesting points.
Thanks. Barbara, I see you have a question.
Go ahead. Oh, hi, Andrew. It's Richard. We're on the same computer. I wanted to ask if you would reflect on the roles of the women. I know it's a story of these three men. I was much more captivated by the dynamics and the presentation of the women. Even the one who seemed least exemplary, Marie, seemed to me shallow rather than evil. And the others had a lot, it seemed to me, to say about the role of women at home during the war. And especially I'd be interested in your reactions and Paul's reactions to the question of how much the way that the women who they left behind welcome them back determines in so many ways the beginning of whether they're able to reintegrate or not. I just felt that there was a nobility to almost every woman who had, a speaking line in this movie, from Hortense up to Myrna Loy, who I thought stole the movie in lots of ways. And Wilma, there was a dignity and a compassion, a weariness and a forbearance, and an acceptance that this job that we've been doing is still something we have to do. We had to take care of everything, and now we have to take care of them, but it's because they love them so much, it seems, Marie accepted. So I'm just curious about the role of women in general in the movie. It seemed to me very much central to.
Yeah, Richard, I think you said it very well, that these, I've never been in this situation, but in any much smaller situation, challenge at work, long or difficult travel, whatever, things that are nothing like going to war, but that are still times when, as individuals, we are separated from our home and our loved ones, and we are looking for some comfort and understanding when we land. The first place we hope to see that is with our significant other, whoever she or he may be. And this film does that, and this is just another area where the film is understated and avoids cliche. I am sure, I shouldn't say I'm sure, I kept waiting for at least one of these men to come home and find the lady in their life with another man. Now, we don't know what Marie's been doing, but that doesn't come across as what she's been doing, at least for much of the first portion of the film. So, you know, they are shown to be crucial, and I think that's entirely understandable. And I think that their reaction to, and their sort of the anchor, the port in this storm of unrest that these men are feeling, is essential. And one of the questions is, will it be enough? You can see in Myrna Loy, you talked about her performance. It's a great performance. One of the things that's great about it is the way in her eyes that she somehow is able to convey both concern for her husband, along with the caring and a sort of wariness about what's he going to do, what's he going to say, how's this going to go. And that's that's of course, those would be among the cocktail of emotions such a person would be feeling, and she's expert enough to convey that in a relatively quiet role. Paul, your thoughts?
Not too much to add there, but I think you're both right about the important role of women in this film, and I think that's why Goldwyn and William Wyler went out of their way to cast the female parts so well. That could have been treated as an afterthought and just focus on the three male leads, but that's not at all the case. The actors here, the actresses here, hit it out of the park. And part of the messaging is what Andrew was getting at, the necessity of that home life and home structure to the reintegration of the vets, or the failure of that reintegration. Also, there are a lot of hints in the film about the contributions these women have made in different ways during the war when their men were not around. We're told that Al's daughter had worked in a hospital. We see her driving a car, which you might think, well, what's the big deal? She's driving a car. But those are hints in that era, right, of a kind of autonomy for women that they wouldn't necessarily have had or have had as easily pre-war. And during the war, right, opportunities open up for them and they start showing their capability. And that is something all the men in the film start to notice at one point or another, that these women are plenty capable of handling themselves, plenty supportive of them, even when they're not behaving at their best. And I think that's a really important piece of the messaging of the film. Even Marie, who is the weakest link, if you will, among them, I think we have to have sympathy for her too, in the sense that she was only married to Fred for 20 days before he went away. So this was a marriage that never had a chance to really grow in a normal context. It might not have worked anyway, but it was a very difficult context. She was a young woman getting involved in a marriage and not ready for it probably, and had to find ways to make ends meet on her own. And I'm not saying all the choices she made are necessarily the best, and she doesn't treat Fred very well at all. But she has been through the ringer too. And so when she's the only one in the film to use the title, right, The Best Years of Our Lives, it's a little annoying in the sense that we kind of know what Fred and company have been through. She really probably shouldn't be putting it that way. But by the same token, she and the other women in the film have also sacrificed. And I think that was a major part of the messaging of the film.
Meredith, you have a question or comment? Oh, okay. Alan, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I thoroughly, I'm sorry.
Okay, first, I want to say that I really enjoyed the movie. A couple of things. First, getting back to Al and his dinner speech, I think he really showed the sergeant that he was, because you didn't quite know. You sat there like his wife, not knowing what he's going to say and whether he's going to embarrass everybody. But in the end, when he went out on a limb and said, you know, we're going to gamble, he sort of co-opted the bank and their outlook going forward toward loans. And after making that kind of announcement, there really wasn't much, I think, that the bank could do, because they were going to gamble. They were going to gamble on America. And I thought that that was very, very powerful and a very a direct motion showing where Al was headed in a good direction. Now, this, what I'm about to say, is more by way of an admission.
Alan, I'm sorry, Alan, but could you please proceed at a little quicker pace?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
That's part of it. The reason there were only 200 200 shots is because the shots seemed to be so long, almost painfully, I thought. And it's hard for me to remember when movies were this long and they had double features. I can't see sitting through it. We had to do it in two sessions, although I enjoyed them both.
Well, I'm glad you did. Thank you for your comments. Movies were not this long in 1946. This was an unbelievable exception to the rule. This was about twice as long, close to twice as long as most movies were at the time. You don't start, you have one in a blue moon up until the late 50s into the 60s. And then they start using that as a sort of marketing ploy with the sort of traveling stage show presentation of movies. But this was exceptionally long for its time. And audiences didn't mind it at all. The movie was enormously financially successful. One of the most successful movies in the history of Hollywood, between Gone with the Wind and The Sound of Music, an enormously successful film. So I guess maybe audiences were happy to get their money's worth. And I think they did in more than one way. Paul?
Not much to add, but I just wonder, I wish we could know the reactions of people in those audiences, because to Andrew's point, this was an incredibly successful film. But I think that's not only because it was incredibly well made by pretty reliable participants, but it was a no-brainer in a sense commercially, because you have all these people dealing with the aftermath of the war, many of them who had been in that war. Of course, they were going to flock to the theaters to see how this might, or in some respects might not, capture their experiences, both as vets and also as relatives of vets. And sociologically, I just wish we had more in the way of information on how audiences process that film. If you could interview somebody walking out of the screening, what would a vet have to have said? What would a vet have said in that moment? I think it would be a testimony, again, to the power of the film.
Meredith, you're back with us. Your question or comment?
Yeah, you can hear me now, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So there's something that I noticed this time, because I think this was the first time I'd ever watched the film in entirety at once, that there's 3 scenes where a woman is helping a man get ready for bed, like buttoning his pajamas and taking off his shoes. And I thought that was really interesting, just in terms of what it says about women's capability and competence So I just kind of wanted to call attention to that. And then I wanted to say, I've just been thinking, I think that the sex life of these vets and their wives is a very important subtext in the film. And I think it's kind of what people are hinting at all the time when they talk about Homer and his hands and all this stuff. And when Wilma finally goes to his bedroom, I think she's saying like, it's okay. So I kind of wanted to know what people thought about that, especially since we've been talking about the role of women being shaken up during the war, just the whole issue of intimacy and intimate relationships between these vets and their wives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is certainly strongly implied. I think it is suggested in the scene you mentioned in Homer's bedroom. I think it's also suggested with Al and Myrna Loy, particularly when they're sort of talking to their daughter about her, interest in a married man and about whether they've ever had to, they've had their fights and they've had their moments and they've had to fall in love again dozens of times. I think all of that is sort of part of that. I think the really interesting thing about all the sort of, the getting ready for bed scenes is that, with this many men and this many women in a movie, even in the 40s, in those situations, you would expect, just statistically speaking, one of the men would make a pass at one of the women. But that doesn't happen. I mean, it happens briefly in a parking lot, but it doesn't happen during any of those scenes. And I think that's because those scenes are so valuable as a microcosm, not just of the sort of physical intimacy you're talking about, but of sort of the intimacy of the relationship more broadly and the intimacy of home more broadly. Paul.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent question, both in terms of how Hollywood struggles historically to represent sexual relationships, even marital ones. But in the context of this film in particular, thinking of sex and romance, or however you want to put it, as a form of intimacy and bonding that clearly is going to be an issue for each of these men in various ways as part of their story of reintegration. And as a nice counterpoint, I always like to think of the night that Fred spends at Al's house, right? He's too drunk to get inside Marie's apartment building. We find out later the buzzer's not working right or something. So he's collapsed on the street. So Al's family very kindly takes him home. They put him in bed. And you might recall that Peggy and Fred really bond the first time there, right? Because he has those nightmares. She comforts him through that. She doesn't mention it in the morning. That really hits him where he lives. He does make a pass at her briefly in the bed when she's tucking him in, but it's very half-hearted and he's drunk and she just kind of brushes it off. But arguably, Fred and Peggy have much more intimacy than that night in terms of emotional connection than Al and his wife, Myrna Loy, do that night, because Al's way too drunk to do anything. And Al, instead of making a night just for his wife and himself, makes a night out on the town, right? And so he gets so plastered, so drunk, that he just collapses in the bed. And you might recall the wife gives him a kiss that is almost a suggestive kiss, even though he's sleeping, even though he's drunk. And he reacts very negatively to that. So they don't bond in that intimate physical way for some time. I think it's the next night that it's hinted that they do. But it's funny that Peggy and Fred do more in terms of emotional connection than Al and his wife do on that night.
Thanks, Paul. Janice, you have a question or comment? Janice, are you there?
Okay, yeah, I'm here. Thank you. I just had two quick things to say. I enjoyed the movie very much, but I had to wonder, I don't know if it was real unusual at the time to bring up these emotional issues of the soldiers coming home, the drinking, the nightmares, the disability. And I guess if it was, then that's good. I feel like it gave it all a little bit of short shrift, like, as long as you've got a good woman in your life, it's all going to be okay. Especially like with the Fred with his nightmares, you kind of get the feeling like, oh, well, now he's going to be with Peggy, and so he's going to be okay. And I'll tell you, my father was in World War II, and he had nightmares all his life. I mean, as a kid, I would hear him shouting in the middle of the night. So, and the drinking too. Two different things. But the other thing that I wanted to ask, and I apologize, I never saw the pre-video. I didn't get a chance to watch it. But tell me a little bit about the actor who played Homer. I mean, obviously he was a disabled person. Was he a disabled veteran? Did he do any more acting after this?
Okay. Thanks for your questions. The first point, movies about these sorts of issues, PTSD and the difficulty of adjusting, were not common. They weren't unheard of, but there was at least one other, came out the same year, I believe, maybe made by John Huston, if I'm recalling correctly. But they were not common at all, and they wouldn't really become common until the late Vietnam and post-Vietnam era, which is when they really started to come out. Regarding the man who played Homer, yes, he was a disabled veteran. He did lose his hands while enlisted, and he was sort of told after this, he was wildly acclaimed, and Paul talked about the acclaim and the reception of his performance. After this film and all the hoopla sort of died down, he was basically kind of politely told, there aren't going to be a lot of parts for someone like you, and maybe you should go back to school, which he did. He went back to college, he got a college degree, and he worked in business and did some veterans activities for much of his life. Later, decades later, he did make a couple more appearances in some films, but by and large, he was not an actor for most of the rest of his life. Paul, did I cover those bases okay?
Pretty much. The thing I would add is he was discovered, if you will, right? He's a non-professional actor. He was discovered in a documentary made about veterans that you can find online. You can YouTube it. And that's where Goldwyn and Weiler saw that he had this kind of natural fit for this part that you wouldn't get from an actor with some special effects prosthetics. They really wanted authenticity for that role. And obviously Russell brought that home. As Andrew said, he didn't get much work after that. He wasn't going to be offered anything. Hollywood was not in a place at that time to be that tolerant, right? They were tolerant enough to give him 2 Oscars on one night, one competitive, one special, but they couldn't make a career for him. He did become a spokesperson of sorts for disabilities groups and communities. So he had a life after Hollywood, if you will. He also, I was just reading this and I don't know the whole story behind it, but he also is the only person to have kind of gotten away with auctioning off his Oscar, which late in life he did. He claimed because his wife was ill and he had medical bills. Others said that the reasons were not as noble. So there's a lot of story there in Harold Russell.
And the name of that service film where he was featured is Diary of a Sergeant, and you can find that on YouTube. Chris D, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi, Andrew. It's actually Al. I was wondering, when did Hollywood seriously deal with the whole nightmare kind of an issue? I thought the script was so fantastic and so well acted that they hit a lot of meaty things without being negative, and you could argue that they were happy. But just that little blip of the nightmares, when did they start to actually address that in film?
I really don't think they do until the Vietnam era, in any significant level. You have to understand that in the 40s and really into the 50s, even though Hollywood begins in the years following World War II to engage with social issues and social problems and even sort of vaguely or broadly political films, the medium still is overwhelmingly, almost exclusively seen as a mode of entertainment. And the films that engage with those things still need to be entertaining. And there's a reason people talk about Hollywood films as one of the cliches about them is that they have an up ending or a happy ending or an optimistic ending, or at least a movie with an ending with room for some happiness. I mean, those of you who joined us for the best years of our, for Sweet Smell of Success, remember how that film found its way, a dark, cynical film about nasty people, found a way to have the final moment be a bit optimistic. And that's what Hollywood's doing. So the fact that these issues are presented and touched upon and even depicted to some extent is enormous progress for the industry during that time. And I think it's really a lot to, it's just not their, they don't believe it's their raison d'etre to do that until the 70s, really. Paul, did you have thoughts?
No, that was
okay. Chris Dematatis, I'm sorry, I'm not saying that right. Did you have a question or comment? Okay, then we'll go to Ellen Slavin.
Hi. I was struck by the fact that tension between the different characters and their relationships, and in particular, the relationship between Al and his son. And when he came home, he gave his daughter a big hug, of course, and his wife a hug and the kiss, and the son, they shook hands. And I thought it was really odd. And of course, when the son wasn't too excited about the souvenirs that his dad had brought him back, and then you never really see the son again. So one of my comments pertain to, at that time, were the relationships between father and son and just shaking hands? Or were there more intimate relationships between father and son during that era?
I mean, I'm not of that vintage, obviously, but I will say that the formality of it and the lack of sort of open expression of sentiment didn't strike me as surprising at all, knowing what I know about older previous generations of my family and others' families. That's not surprising to me in the least. And I think the part of that there is not that. I think that's a father-son, and that's not all that uncommon, particularly for that sort of class of family. The thing about him not particularly well receiving what his father brings him or seeming all that interested in it, I think is a way meant to show a generation gap and the boy's youth in a way that he's that much younger than his sister, that she understood more what the war was about, what the sacrifices were, that what they were combating, and the boy sort of just kind of doesn't get it and isn't really all that interested in getting it, which of course is a very, I think it's a brief, but it's a very potent demonstration of the enormous schism that's going to develop between the greatest generation and the baby boomers. I know that obviously that boy's not a baby boomer because he's a teenager by the time the war is over, but he's the generation after that which served in World War II. And it's a great foretelling of what is coming down the pike culturally.
So
Paul.
I would add to that. I had mentioned earlier the intergenerational struggle between someone like Al and his fellow vets and those older men at the bank. This is a good example of the other side of that, right? That Al, even as a father, is going to feel a certain degree of alienation from his son. And I think Andrew's right that that kind of distance between father and son was encoded to a large degree as a cultural norm, even without the war, right? But if you throw the war into the mix and the difference of experiences there, it's almost predictable that they will not have much to say to each other right now. As for the war trophies, I have a friend, an old friend that I don't really keep in touch with now, but his father had been in the Pacific and captured a samurai sword. And I always thought it was a rather odd thing to make a trophy out of, right? Because obviously someone else had to be slaughtered to get it. And so the son, in a way, is reacting to the brutality, implicit or explicit, in the capture of that weapon. And I think that disturbs him. And what I thought was pretty amazing about that scene, I mean, for the most part, the son comes off as someone right out of Leave It to Beaver, right? We're already there. But the innocence of that boy, his intellectual curiosity, and remember what he talks to dad about: Hiroshima, atomic weapons, and the potential for a war that no one comes out of and wins. And that is another key difference there, right? Is that this kid, even though he hasn't been serving like Al, he has been watching and listening and learning, and he realizes that the world has just changed on everyone. And that is going to only further contribute to the divide that Andrew's talking about.
A couple of things that I saw in the chat that I wanted to mention in regard to recent comments or questions. One is, of course, the Manchurian Candidate. Someone in the chat mentioned the Manchurian Candidate from 1962 deals with PTSD. It's a little bit hazy on it, so to speak, because of course there's the brainwashing element, but certainly the nightmares and the aftermath is there, and that's how that is coded. Absolutely. The other point that I think Meredith brought up is that, you know, he left that, we don't know exactly how many years Al's been gone, but we can imagine that he left and his son seemed like a little boy. And when he came back, his son seemed like a young man. And Al may have been reluctant to sort of engage in, you know, the sort of whatever, a hug or kiss or whatever you might with a little boy, with someone who now appears to have developed significantly. It's something worth thinking about, I think. Charlotte, do you have a question or comment? Okay, we will then go to, oh, Charlotte, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I think my comment was about Al and his speech at the dinner and his boss. And of course, at the speech, I was really nervous. I thought for sure he was going to get fired. But my feeling was, my father was in the Second World War, and he wrote a book about his experiences, and he came back very changed. But I think about what happened after that war with the GI Bill, and I was very optimistic about the boss. I thought, well, maybe the boss is getting it, that we really have to give these guys a chance. So I was quite optimistic about that. Also want to say I really enjoyed the movie. I'm not as well versed in movies as most of you seem to be. I have been trying to watch more older films during this pandemic and found them quite boring, to tell you the truth. I did not see a lot of character development. I thought they were slow, and I thought this was just the opposite. I thought the characters were developed. I felt I had a really good feeling about them, and maybe it was slower than normal, but it was just great. I loved it. Thank you so much.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think things are left intentionally ambiguous with the boss's reaction to that speech, and I think there is a way to read that he sort of comes out pleasantly surprised by it. It didn't seem like he was faking his appreciation, although it's hard to say. Paul, do you have a question or comment?
You mean Paul Wright?
No, Paul Jablow. No, okay. Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Here, I'm here.
Oh, Paul, okay, go ahead, Paul.
I just was going a couple of things way back, two unrelated things. Somebody asked how the guy could have been a captain when he was only a soda jerk. And the military answer to that is he could have had a battlefield commission for heroism. That happened a lot. Making officers at the time was not a question of West Point necessarily, or going to officer candidate school. There was a lot of stuff done on the battlefield right in combat. So.
Right, and at the end of the film, his father's reading his citations and other papers that that Fred's no longer.
He could well have had it's not unlikely. Yeah. His soda jerk thing would have had very little to do with it under the pressures of the war.
Right.
I think an interesting subtext there, Paul, is, and I think this was to some degree by design, it would have been easy to have Al be a high-ranking commissioned officer given his economic status, right? And it would have been easy to make Fred anything but a captain, right? Far from a captain.
Right.
But the screenwriters here and the director and the cast, they definitely went in the direction of playing against type on your expectations there, right? So Al is a banker, he's got money, he's got social standing, the best apartment in town, but he's just a sergeant, which is a pretty damn important job on the battlefield, don't get me wrong, but he doesn't have an officer's rank. That's why he doesn't want to be called sir, right? That's for officers.
Right.
And Fred comes from these really humble origins that we see firsthand, right? He lives by the train tracks.
Yeah, well,
the Army and we see him elevating to a captaincy through the means that you described, because I think that is the explanation there. And I think that was a kind of nod to the desperate meritocracy of wartime and the American military.
I mean, the military at the time was a very democratizing institution, as long as you were a white person.
Exactly. And that's the key limit there. But I think that's the explanation. And I think the filmmakers didn't want to avoid that.
No.
All right. Thanks a
Hello,
lot.
this is Arlene.
Okay, just a moment, Arlene. Just a moment, please. Paul, thanks for your comment, okay?
Okay.
Arlene, go ahead.
Okay, first of all, if anyone has not seen the film or wants to see it again, it is on tonight at 8 p.m. on TCM. So that's an opportunity for people to see it again and look at what we've talked about here. Also, I do like a lot of the old films. I am one of the older generation, have lived through the war, knew some people, including my husband, who had reactions to things such as Hiroshima. Though I'm against it, he felt that he'd be in the Pacific or would have lost his life in the Pacific if we had not done the bombing. So the reactions of people have a lot to do with what they have gone through or what was facing them.
That's true. Thank you very much, Arlene. Roseann, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I do, actually. First of all, I did really love the film. And I wanted to, a couple of things you already touched on, but I just wanted to give my spin on it. The thing with the son was that I don't think he connected with this guy as his father. He connected more with what was going on every day with the war in the news. And he hadn't seen his father in years. So we didn't connect with him being in the war as his father. This guy shows up, brings him trophies. He asks a lot of questions about the war, but not about his own father's personal experience. So he just didn't connect with him as a father. And apparently Al was away for some years because he asks the wife, what happened? The kids grew up, so when he left, they're kids and now they're grown up.
Her answer, by the way, was amazing because she said, I did my absolute best to keep them exactly the way,
right.
Which was a way of saying you're crazy to expect them not to grow and change.
That's right. While you're gone, things don't stop. They continue. And then I wanted to talk about the sacrifices that women made. Not only did women make sacrifices, but they began to assert themselves. But one of the sacrifices that's evident in Al's household is that the daughter is doing these domestic chores. And it's because they don't have a maid anymore. And it's mentioned, they couldn't afford the maid anymore, and Peggy's out working. The women hold down the fort at home. They pay the bills, they go out and work, they raise those children by themselves, and they learn to make all these decisions on their own. The world has changed, and you get the feeling about how much the world has changed when those guys are in that plane, when the 3 servicemen are in that plane coming home, and they're, you know, looking out of the plane and seeing superficially all that's changed. That's only the beginning. That's only the superficial stuff. Everything has changed. Everybody's attitudes, their place in the world. Even the drugstore where Fred worked is now like this department store.
Gone corporate.
Right, it's gone corporate, right, bought out by a corporate entity. Everything's changed. And so you get an inkling about that when these guys are looking out the window and commenting on just things passing by. Anyway, that was just my take on it. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. The opening of the film, when that plane ride back to Boone City, you know, basically sort of, you know, foreshadows or sort of lays out what the large theme of the movie is going to be. And of course, you know, that's just smart storytelling, as well as good drama, I guess. Kathleen, do you have a question or comment?
This is Ron with Kathleen.
Hi,
We
Ron.
both enjoyed the film, but I was wondering, it seemed to me that Dana Andrews would be the lead character and would be getting the award for Best Actor rather than Frederick Marsh. Was there any controversy about that, or?
Well, the Academy sets out its rules, and as long as you're within the rules, the actors and, well, at that time the studios would have decided who would have been under consideration for what category. And Frederick March was much more of the sort of leading actor stature at that time, though Andrews was certainly on the rise. So I think that's really more of a sort of inside baseball industry thing. And it probably wouldn't have raised very many eyebrows outside of perhaps Hollywood. And I'm not even sure if it would have there. Frank, do you have a question or comment?
Oh, I am. Oh, hello.
Yes, hi.
Hi, it's Dorothy with Frank. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the scene in the drugstore where the man who orders the ham and cheese sandwich and is reading the newspaper engages in this conversation about, I think the newspaper says senators talk of more war, and he talks with Homer about, it almost sounds as though he is talking a little bit of propaganda at the time about how you were engaged in this and essentially thrown away. Can you talk about the historical references there and what it all means?
Sure. I think, because I found the fact that we could read that newspaper headline so clearly, I found that interesting. And I think it says something like senators talk of other war or another war or something like that. Paul, I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, from an historical standpoint, this film, that moment in the film, is a great reminder of the anti-interventionist streak that was a mile wide among a lot of people in the United States before the war, and the extent to which that persisted for some after the war, even in the wake of victory. And I think that's often overlooked. You know, we watch the documentaries, we see a united Allied front, we see America firing on all cylinders to contribute to the war effort and win the war, bring it to a conclusion. And we often forget the dissent that quite obviously racks any society in the middle of any conflict, including this one. And I think that was a really honest moment in the film. Of course, we also get the satisfaction of literally getting a sort of Nazi sympathizer punched in the face, right? Dana Andrews is so annoyed at that guy and how he's treating Homer, right, the disabled veteran, that he punches him and loses his job as a result. And I think it's there very pointedly to remind the audience that not everybody has the same interpretation of what got us into the war, how the war was prosecuted, or even why it was fought and how it ended. And I think that's a nice, honest moment in the film.
And it's something that you're I won't say only going to see, but you're far more likely to see in a film that is contemporaneous or closely contemporaneous to the war. Because the farther we get away from the war, the more sort of cemented in the popular consciousness of that film, of that war, as a good war, a justified war, which, don't get me wrong, I think it was, but that was a universally held opinion. We tend to, subsequent generations tend to look back on it and think that incorrectly. And so the fact that this comes out in 46, that's definitely there, and it's an important element of the culture at the time.
Can I add one thing, Andrew?
Yeah.
The audience is quite obviously meant to be with Homer and Fred in that moment, and to see that guy as spouting propaganda, selling a lie that really dishonors their service, right, and their sacrifice, and the sacrifice of all the people who didn't come home. That said, and I think Andrew's point here is really important, right, that this is right after the war, that this needs to be emphasized. As a contrast, I did a double feature last night. One was this film, to remind myself of it again. You know, I've seen it many times. I wanted to watch it fresh. And then I followed it up with Terrence Malick's Thin Red Line. And if you watch that film, it will have you walking away saying, there's no point to this whatsoever. It's just human beings' lives on both sides being thrown away for nothing, which is not exactly the point the propagandist in the drugstore is making, but it is a kind of existential point about the futility and pointlessness of war that Malick is definitely making in that movie. And it's a night and day kind of messaging to what we get in this film and in that moment. And I'm not picking a side there, but I am trying to emphasize the contrast.
You know, it's funny because I know this is heresy to say, but I can't resist it, that when you describe the Thin Red Line and the point of the film being that this is a waste of, this is a pointless endeavor, it's a waste of time and a waste of human life, my response to that is, isn't that also a description of every Terrence Malick movie of the last 15 years?
Fair point, fair point. And it's also like every Terrence Malick film, an argument that human beings are a blight on nature and a blight on the planet.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's get to one more question. Anne, are you there with a question or comment?
Yes, hi, thanks. My question is really about a casting issue. I was always curious why Hoagie Carmichael was chosen to play Homer's uncle. I mean, was it that because he was popular at the time, or did he have some connection to Wyler or Goldman? I was always curious why he was cast in that part.
He was popular at the time. He was supposed to, I don't think he actually ended up doing it, but originally he was supposed to contribute a song or two to the soundtrack. I think they ended up using, I don't think he ended up writing any original or new material for the film, and what he does perform is older hits from the MGM library or what have you. But I think that was probably part of the reason he was cast, was the thought that originally he was going to contribute some new music to the film.
I think too, it doesn't hurt to have someone that silky smooth and genial and kind to step into that role as Homer's uncle. I believe he's his uncle. And in a way, he's the uncle to everyone in town, right? He's the local bar owner who really is your therapist. And that, I think, is necessary in the film to be a kind of touchstone for Homer, right? Because he's fled his own family. He can't take the welcome, if you will. And he finds a more gentle welcome with Carmichael. And he really, I think, plays that part perfectly.
Okay, we'll take one more. Eileen, you have a question or comment?
Oh, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I loved this movie. I was so glad I watched it, partly because it made me realize that when I thought about the end of World War II, I thought about the victory parades, and then I thought about the plenty of the 1950s, and I didn't really think about the readjustment. So it really was like such an incredibly intense emotional thing for me to watch. I appreciate that. I put my question in the chat and then I got disconnected for a minute, so I apologize if it's come up, but I was really curious about Fred's assistant who became his boss. He looked like he was war age, maybe. Maybe he was too young to go to the war. Did anyone get struck by why he stayed back and got promoted?
Always assumed it was because his name was Stinky. No, I thought maybe he seemed to have rather thick eyeglasses. I don't know if that was enough to keep you out of service or not, but that's what I saw. But
It was 4F in one way or another, right?
yeah,
yeah. I think it's interesting that character, for whatever reason, he didn't go to war. He didn't, and he was working more or less for Fred before, and now Fred has to become his subordinate. And this guy Stinky clearly likes lording it over Fred now and reminding him that I'm not called Stinky anymore. So the backstory there is a little hard to figure out, but it's again an intergenerational tension. I think what you want to keep in mind here too is how typical it was, how expected it was that older men, not old men, but older men like Frederick March's character were expected to sign up and serve, right? It wasn't something that only the young were expected to do. In fact, William Wyler himself served, made a war documentary in the process, and he was in his late 30s when he joined up. So he was not alone in that. There were quite a few above 20s soldiers in that conflict.
Yeah, Jimmy Stewart among them.
Jimmy Stewart,
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for joining us and for your great selection of a film and the wonderful introduction. If you haven't watched Paul's video introduction to this film, it is on our website and you should definitely check it out. A lot more great context there will further increase your appreciation of the film. We encourage you to sign up for our emails so you will learn right away what each week's film will be when our Thursday email comes out. And we have a lot on our website, Theater 5 at brynmarfilm.org, Film Studies Online at brynmarfilm.org. As I mentioned, we have 2 courses, paid courses starting on June 2nd. One is a one-time lecture on the origin of cinema, and the other is our flagship film language course, which will be offered again after having sold out this month. So thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon for another film discussion.
Thank you, everybody.